I hope you had a chance to digest the last keynote. Thank you for laughing. Welcome to our third keynote for today. Faith in contrast. Understanding others, deepening our own faith. Brother Cawley will discuss interfaith encounters and the way they help us to understand ourselves and show respect in our community. So we'll turn the time to Brother Cawley.
Well, I thought that my task here today was to describe to you the difference between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the priesthood work. It's a little difficult for me to think that you don't know all about that already. Living in this community and having the brethren here teach us, and they talk about it often enough. But that'll be the theme of what I'm going to say. We live in the world of Mormonism. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is part of Mormonism. And the work that we're engaged in is also Mormonism. And there are a surprising number of organizations of different kinds across the United States which are part of Mormonism. I was surprised one day when I went into the library at the University of Utah. I was kind of browsing and I ran across a master's thesis, which I didn't read. I just took it off the shelf and looked at it. But the subject of the master's thesis was all of the splinter groups of Mormonism that have broken off from the mainstream Mormonism over the years since the days of Joseph Smith. And there were 110 of them. Couldn't believe it. And so there are a lot of people that regard us as a splinter group breaking off of the church, which in a sense we are. But I'm going to try and get that a little bit in perspective today. But it's the case that people from the time that Joseph Smith was alive separated themselves from his organization, created their own organization. You can name names. They're all out of the history of the Mormon Church. And I think the reason for that was that the doctrines that Joseph Smith presented were so iconoclast to the general world of Christianity. We believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God and he received revelations from God. Many of these revelations are included in the Doctrine and Covenants, and so that they're publicly available from the church, and we can get the Doctrine and Covenants and read it and learn about those revelations. But some of those things that he taught were so strange to the Christian world that they can't abide them. And so if you go out and listen to the missionaries that are coming around, or that not come around here, but that come around, missionary work from the Protestant sects in the United States of America, some of those doctrines they label as blasphemy because they disagree with the tradition that comes to them from the movement of the Christians starting after the crucifixion of Christ. And so Mormonism has a bad reputation among those people, and largely they claim that Mormonism is not a Christian religion. I don't know how they can do that if they just read the Book of Mormon, let alone the Doctrine and Covenants. It is a Christian religion. We believe in the atonement of Jesus Christ. like the world does. But Mormonism takes a little different take on it. And Joseph Smith introduced doctrines that they just can't abide. And so some of the people who felt that way about some of the things that he brought from Revelation, revealed from God, were not correct either. And so they left the church and set up their own organization. David Whitmer did. What's his name did. Sidney Rigdon did. And there are many others that did. I don't know if you've run across them in studying your history, but those doctrines were perpetuated by the associates that Joseph Smith had in the authority structure of the church, and primarily Brigham Young and John Taylor, who succeeded him as presidents of the church. So many people claim that some of those doctrines were originated by Brigham Young and not by Joseph Smith, particularly the Organized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that was founded by the sons of Joseph Smith and his wife Emma. And their claim was that plural marriage was instituted by Brigham Young, and Joseph Smith never taught it, never practiced it, and it was all Brigham Young's responsibility. And of course, historically, that can't be upheld because there's too much evidence showing that Joseph Smith not only taught the doctrine, but he practiced it himself. But that's one of those doctrines that goes against the general Christian world, which is monogamic and has been for a long, long time. Not the whole history of Christianity. Early Christians practiced it, but not for much. The other doctrine that Brigham Young announced was the Adam God doctrine. And the Adam God doctrine, again, was laid at his feet, and they tried to pretend that Joseph Smith never taught that doctrine. His sermons that are published contain very little. The King Follett Discourse, so-called, if you read that, which is it's published in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, so it's there to read. He talks about gods and the plurality of gods, and he talks about God being an exalted man, which is getting into the Adam God doctrine. These two features of Mormonism are probably the two most prominent ones that people in the general Christian world object to. Well, the church had to deal with those and perpetuate those, and as long as the associates that knew and worked with Joseph Smith were alive, those doctrines were given credence, and plural marriage was practiced. But the Adam God doctrine was never fully accepted by the membership of the church. Now, here's one of the things that we have to confront. And if you listen to the brethren talk when they get in the pulpit, they talk about this all the time. The traditions from the Christian world were so deeply embedded in the membership of the church, that they could not bring themselves to accept the Adam God doctrine. Well, so what happened to it? The authorities of the church decided, trying to get people to accept it, and the people not accepting it, to just kind of let it rest. Just let that rest. We won't talk about that. Well, what happens if you follow that kind of a policy is, in time, it just fades into the background, and it becomes something that people don't accept. The church, in time, and the time time frame I'm talking about here is from about the late 1860s until 1930s. And during that period of time, the thinking of the authorities of the church changed until they altered their doctrine of deity from what Joseph Smith taught to what the general Christian world believes. And one of the great scholars of the LDS Church, James E. Talmage, who was held up as a great, brilliant mind, wrote a book called Jesus the Christ, in which an altered version of the concept or doctrine of deity was given. And the church has used that. And in fact, today, that book is one of the books, along with the Doctrine and Covenants and the Book of Mormon, which are the authorized publications of the church. The church has moved on from that to pretty much accepting the general Christian view of the deity, which is that Jesus Christ is God. Joseph Smith never taught that. He taught that God was an exalted man who had lived the life on an earth like this and become exalted and achieved godhood, and then created the world for us, his children. Children born in the spirit world before we came here. And so the similar thing happened in a similar frame of time from about 1868 until 1934 is, I guess, a good year to when these things are rounded out and complete with the doctrine of plural marriage. The history of that doctrine is Joseph Smith. It was revealed to him, say, somewhere around maybe 1831. We're not sure of the date. And he was commanded to teach it and practice it. But it was so contrary to the ideas of the society in which he lived that while he practiced it personally, he didn't teach it. The story is that an angel with a drawn sword appeared to him and commanded him that he should teach it and promote it among the people, or he threatened him with his life. That story is recorded in the journals of a number of people that were acquainted with it at the time Joseph Smith was alive. So it's not entirely a figment of somebody's imagination, at least contemporary information has that story. And so in about 1842, he began to do that. And he did it on a private basis. He didn't confront the membership of the church with it. It was one of these things, again, as with the Adam God doctrine, a sensitive issue because of the traditions of the world and how they were inculcated into the minds and hearts of the people. And there were people, members of the church, that couldn't accept that doctrine. Sidney Rigdon is maybe the most prominent one. His tradition in the Christian world of monogamy was so strong that he abhorred that principle. And as a consequence, he got disaffected with the church and went to Pittsburgh and organized his own church. People called Joseph Smith a fallen prophet because of his introduction of that doctrine. So during this period of time, then we have a separation occurring between the sentiments of the people and what Joseph Smith established. An additional thing that Joseph Smith taught, and it's in the fifth article of faith, that a man must be called of God by revelation and the laying on of hands by those in authority to preach the gospel and administer in the ordinances thereof. That is to say, if you want to act for God, you have to have authority from God. You can get warm, fuzzy feelings in your bosom and tell people your opinions and convert them to the way you think, and you can even go so far as to perform ordinances that you're not authorized to because you haven't been given authority from God. And in fact, that's where the whole Christian world is today. They don't have the authority that Jesus Christ gave to his apostles when he was alive. They don't have that authority. That authority wasn't passed on by the apostles. And so they have created their own authority structures in various ways with the Catholic Church and the Protestant sects that are scattered all over the world. And they perform baptisms, which is the fundamental ordinance of the gospel. First, as Joseph Smith termed it, the first outward ordinance of the gospel. And they do this in various ways, and they have their ways of doing it. Doctrine and Covenants, and I think it's section 57, I'm not sure, somewhere in the Doctrine and Covenants. People are outrightly condemned by the Lord for doing that, pretending that you can administer the ordinances of the gospel when you don't have authority to do it. Well, Joseph Smith got the authority to do it from Peter, James, and John in about 1829. The date isn't certain, but around June of 1829. And this is one of the things about the restoration of the gospel you should understand. Joseph Smith was not alone all by himself. He was with Oliver Cowdery. In other words, he had a witness to that event, someone who'd say, yes, I was there, that happened. And Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith were given that authority, which we call the high priest apostleship. The reason we call it the high priest apostleship is that in the 84th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, speaking to those men who had that authority, he called them my apostles, high priests. And so we've taken that term, high priest apostle, and used it as a name to call this authority. And that's the crux right there. This is something that we need to understand. If you want to administer the gospel to mankind, you have to have authority from God to do it. This is the priesthood. And when I was 14 years old and attending a Aaronic priesthood class in Salt Lake, was taught by my brother Alfred E. Olszewski, and he gave us a definition of the priesthood. And this is the definition. The priesthood is the authority from God delegated to man to act and speak in his name on the earth. That's the definition that he gave for priesthood. And it fits in very well with the fifth article of faith. So now, priesthood is the authority of God. You don't have it, you can't administer in his name legitimately. He won't recognize the results of what you do. And I'm not trying to condemn all the people who are doing things without authority. I mean, the Doctrine and Covenants condemns them. I don't have to. I realize that there are lots of good things being done in the name of Christianity in the United States and Europe and all over the world. There are Christian sects all over the world. Some of them are severely persecuted, especially in Muslim countries. And they do a lot of good. And I respect that. I don't have anything to say derogatorily with regard to them. It's just that if you don't have the authority, the acts you perform have no consequence as far as God is concerned. You can do a lot of good among men, and I'm sure that God himself respects that. I certainly do. It's not legitimate in his eyes. So now we have these elements. In 1868, the Congress of the United States began to enact laws trying to stamp out plural marriages that was practiced in Utah territory by the Mormon people. And from 1968, where the first law went through Congress, until 1877, I think it was, they continued to enact laws that were more and more severe to penalize the church until finally the laws included disfranchising anybody who was a member of the Mormon church and believed in polygamy, as cheating the property of the church, which meant all the ward houses and the temples and things that they had. These were really wicked laws. I don't know of many that Congress has passed in the whole history of the United States that are worse than they were. And pressure was put upon the church. The federal marshals were dispatched to the territory of Utah to ferret out people living plural marriage and putting them in jail, because the law included jail time and a fine if you were practicing plural marriage. And there were thousands of men who were put in jail as a result of those laws, spent time in jail. When the crisis came, Wilford Woodruff was president of the church. And he issued what we call the Manifesto of 1890. And you need to read that and understand what it says, because Wilford Woodruff did not say, I'm going to stop believing in the principle of plural marriage. I'm going to stop encouraging people to enter it. He said, the church is going to discontinue it. So that it left it up to the individual. You weren't obligated, but as a member of the church, you didn't have that doctrine placed on you anymore. So now, among the members of the church, there were many people that were engaged in the practice of plural marriage. Southern Utah was a hotbed of polygamy. I have relatives all over here that, because of polygamy, because of plural marriage. Many of those people could not accept the idea that this principle, which was introduced by Joseph Smith and substantiated and be made a tenet of the church by Brigham Young, was a correct principle and had to be practiced, and they refused to do differently, even though they spent jail time and paid a fine to do it. On the other hand, there were members of the church who followed the recommendation of the church authorities. Eventually was given to them that they should choose one of their wives and live with her and not associate with the other. Now, this word associate is really important, because you have a problem here. The United States of America passed these anti-polygamy laws, pointed directly at the church. And yet there were men all over the country who were keeping mistresses, and the authorities were winking at that activity. And the question here is, what are we going to do about that? It would be hypocritical if we allowed that to happen and then try to enforce these laws. We should go maybe and try to enforce these laws on some of them. So they came up with this idea of not plural marriage, but they call unlawful cohabitation, because if you're a man with a family and you have a mistress on the side, you're not living with her, you're keeping it on the side. And so that's not cohabitation. But if you take the responsibility of having a plural family and you support them and you bring the children up and raise them and teach them and be a father to them and a husband to all of your wives, that's cohabiting. And so the actual crime that they were prosecuted for was this unlawful cohabitation. What it was. And if they could find evidence that you were living with more than one woman, if you had two houses and they could see you go in one day and go in another the other day on a regular basis, you were breaking that law and they put you in jail. So these laws were so onerous and they were so threatening to the church. And Brother Woodruff was under such pressure. You need to read that history and try and understand how much pressure he was under. And he finally signed this manifesto. And he wrote in his journal, I've come to the point in my life as president of the church when I have to take action for the temporal welfare of the church, not the spiritual, the temporal welfare of the church, which meant all of this property that was being seized by the United States government. And so his concern over that led him to sign the manifesto. And he put in his journal, this was for the temporal salvation, not the spiritual salvation. Well, at that time, and Wilford Woodruff didn't live very long after that. And so the other authorities of the church, he was succeeded by Lorenzo Snow as president of the church and then Joseph S. Smith as president of the church. And their philosophy about all of this was that they would continue to maintain that the church did not sanction plural marriage, which every time you hear language about that, reading the history, the church doesn't sanction. But privately as individuals, they continue to promote it and carry on. They thought that they could do that surreptitiously, and then when the crisis blew over, they could reinstate plural marriage and go on down the road of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with that principle in place. However, the membership of the church pretty much was tired of plural marriage and didn't want it. The majority of the people of the church in the early 20th century, and particularly the rising generation, the young people who were in their 20s in 1910, around that time, didn't want plural marriage. The manifesto they thought was a revelation, or they thought at least it was an edict from the church that they had to obey, and they were glad to have it so. And so the probability of being able to carry on surreptitiously and then reinstating the principle at some later time when things settled down, that probability was smaller and smaller and smaller as time went on. And in fact, it never took hold as Lorenzo Snow expected it would do. So you have these two prominent doctrines that were instituted by Joseph Smith, more or less being abandoned by the church. The Adam God doctrine, which they let rest, sink into oblivion until today. They don't believe it, and their doctrine is totally contrary to it. And the law of celestial and plural marriage, which they have abandoned and let go. And today, if you talk to the members of the church, they will tell you that the manifesto was a revelation. Nobody in 1890, contemporary with the issuing of the manifesto, called it a revelation. And that's why when I put together the 2-volume set called Messages from the Underground that have the priesthood publications in them, the priesthood has used over the years to instruct people, I included 2 articles from Truth magazine explaining why and how the manifesto was not a revelation, and that nobody at the time regarded it as so, and that they publicly proclaimed that it wasn't a revelation. It was an expediency to try and get out from under the onerous arm of the United States government. And the church engaged in duplicity. On the one hand, saying that they had dispensed with it as a church, and they could claim that because it was given out as a rule of the church, but in the behind the back, they were perpetuating it. Well, this brings up the central question here. If you're going to perpetuate plural marriage as a principle of the gospel among the people, there is an ordinance connected with it, which is called the covenant of marriage, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. That ordinance is performed for people who enter into the covenant. Oh, you got to have authority from God to do that. You can't perpetuate it without the proper authority. When John Taylor died, the last man on earth who was given that authority by Joseph Smith in 1842 was gone. That authority, whatever it was that Peter, James, and John gave to Joseph Smith, was gone. It's not in the church. Where is it? Well, fortunately, God took some action to see to it that authority was perpetuated in the earth. And he did it in 1886. That's why we talk so much about 1886. And I don't think we're going to stop talking. You might get sick of hearing, 1886 this, 1886 that. But we're not going to stop talking about it. Brother Guy commissioned us, in fact, and he commissioned all the elders in Israel. You can read it in his sermons that are in the sermon book, to teach and teach and teach this 1886 episode to the children so that they'll understand. This is how authority was provided to carry on the principle of plural marriage and the fullness of the gospel authoritatively. And it happened in the meeting on September 26th and September 27th, 1886. So now, here we have a little sociological situation that you have got to understand. There was pressure in 1886. The federal marshals were in Utah trying to round people up and prosecute them under the anti-polygamy laws. Government was threatening to take action against the church, escheat their property, which eventually they created a law that allowed them to do that. And the situation was publicly, when the manifesto was issued, that was the end of it. Privately, we're going to carry it on. So what happened was, John Taylor was the president of the church in 1886. He was hiding from the federal marshals that were after him. He was in the what they called the underground. They called it the underground. He wasn't the only one. They were after George Buchanan. They were after Joseph F. Smith. And it was sent to Hawaii on a mission to get him out from the environment where the federal marshals were trying to round up men that were violating those laws. And others of the authorities of the church who were practicing plural marriage. We have the account of what happened on September 26th and 27th, 1886, from the affidavit that was issued by Lauren Woolley in 1928, 29. It is the written record that tells about this incident. And I won't go over details about it, but you can read about it in the pamphlet, The Four Hidden Revelations, which is also included in Messages from the Underground. That affidavit is published there. You can read it, and you can read the background information that the brethren provided around it when they discuss in the Four Hidden Revelations the 1886 revelation. John Taylor retired to his bedroom, and he was visited during the night by Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ, because the brethren that day had given him a document which was like the manifesto that was eventually signed by Wilford Woodruff, an appeal from the people and some of the authorities of the church that he do something about this polygamy issue. And he told them, I'll take it up with the Lord. And so he did when he retired that night. And he was visited by those two beings. The next day he held a meeting. There were 13 people present at that meeting, in which he gave them the results of his inquiry. And the results were given in the 1886 revelation, which you also can read, in which the Lord said, this is an eternal law. My law is eternal. And how can I revoke an everlasting law? So you have that law, it's been instituted, and you can't abandon it. And so John Taylor refused to do anything to go along with all the pressure that was coming down upon the church from the federal authorities. And also at that meeting, he took 5 men and gave them this priesthood that Joseph Smith had gotten from Peter, James, and John, and given to John Taylor as one of those members of the Quorum of 12 Apostles in the church in 1842. So the authority was preserved. Now you have to understand a little bit about this authority. This authority is the highest priesthood authority a man can hold on the earth. It has jurisdiction over all of God's activities in the earth. It has the keys, which were restored to Joseph Smith in the Kirtland Temple, and other keys, which are just authorization to do a certain work. And so it has all of those things. Some people claim that because of the wording in the affidavit that Lauren Woolley issued, that those men were only given authority to perform plural marriages and have any other authority. So it created a situation where some people believing that could come to them to get married and disregard their authority for other purposes. And so we have thousands of people that we call independents who followed that idea along in one way or another, or some other idea. There are other ideas that the independents follow. They have a hard time addressing the question of authority, because the authority was given to those 5 men, and they were ordained, set apart, one after the other. John W. Woolley was first, so he was a senior member of that group. His son Warren was lesser than he was in seniority. I don't know that the order of ordination is exactly the same as the way the names were given in the affidavit that Lauren Woolley issued. But George Q. Cannon, who was the counselor to John Taylor, and the president of the church was one of them, and Samuel Bateman and Charles H. Wilkin were two men who were, along with Lauren Woolley, assigned guardianship of John Taylor to take him back and forth in the underground and keep him away from the United States Marshals. So those were the men. We call this group of men the Priesthood Council. It's kind of easy to understand if you know about the keys of the priesthood and pertaining to marriage. It's the keys of Elijah that open up the authorization to perpetuate celestial and plural marriage among the people. It's those keys, the keys of Elijah. If you understand, you will realize that in every area of the world, it may not be something that the people are authorized to practice. You just go and read the Book of Mormon and the prophet Jacob and what he had to say about the abominations that were going on among the people over this polygamy business and commanding them not to take more than one wife and not have any concubines. And he explained it by saying, if God wants to raise up children unto Abraham, seed unto Abraham, he will institute that principle. Otherwise, one wife and no concubines. So in the days of Joseph Smith, he did that. And in the Kirtland Temple, he brought the keys of Elijah to Joseph Smith so that he would have not more authority. There's no more authority given when you have a key, but it's the authorization to initiate and continue on a work. And it's the keys of Elijah because Elijah is the one who had the authority to, as it's given, as it's worded in the Bible, turn the hearts of the children to the fathers and the fathers to the children. And it's this sealing that occurs that is done under the keys of Elijah, and that includes the ceremony, the covenant of marriage. Given that knowledge, the argument that these men were only authorized to do plural marriages kind of falls down, doesn't hold up very well. If you have the authority to do marriages under the new and everlasting covenant, you have the authority to do everything else that comes under the jurisdiction of the high priest apostleship. And so the argument is kind of specious. But if you understand how things operate in the church, at least, if they were right about that, then this authority is simply a delegated authority from John Taylor to perform marriages. When John Taylor dies, that delegation expires. That's the way it is in the church. If you're a counselor of the president of the church dies, you're no longer a counselor. There will be another president of the church appointed. He will choose his counselors. And it's not going to be you, or it may not be you. Might not. So if these people are right who claim the only authority to perform marriages was given on that occasion, when John Taylor died, who laid his hands on their head and gave them it, their delegation ends. So we have all these people, the ones that we call independents, that, yeah, we'll come and get married by your authority, but those men only had authority to marry. They didn't have any further authority. John Taylor died. Wilford Woodruff died. Where is that authority? And so this incident in 1886 was the crucial event as far as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints goes in its history, because it marked a major parting. Now, that parting didn't happen in 1890. It didn't happen in 1886. It took a little bit of time, about 40 years. People had to die off younger generation, ignorant of things, had to come in. And so it came to the point in the I won't say late, in the 1920s and the 1930s, where the policy of the church and the attitude of the church, as far as the general authorities and the membership went, pretty much the membership, the attitude was very much hardened against plural marriage. And so the church began to persecute and prosecute people living that principle who were members of the church. And of course, the only authority they have is to cut them off from the church. And so that's what they did. And if you take these men that I'm talking about, and early on, I think Samuel Bateman didn't live too much longer. Charles H. Wilkin didn't live too much longer, but George Buchanan lived till about 1910. If you take these men, they operated by the authority they were given in the church. John W. Woolley was the Salt Lake Temple authority in the Salt Lake Temple. He could bring people in and marry them and throw them married. He did. Some of those are marriages. Some of those marriages are on the records of the church. But he also authorized other people, members of the church, authorities of the church, to carry on plural marriages, and they were doing it in more or less a widespread but secret manner during the period of time after the manifesto until the 1920s. And then the church began to go after people within their membership and cutting them off. So John W. Woolley was cut off. And then Warren Woolley was cut off. And then Leslie Broadbent was cut off, who was a man that was called by Lord Woolley and given that priesthood. And one after the other, anybody who held this authority was cut off from the church if he'd been a member. And so now the church had not recognized that authority for a long time, but it was operating within their ranks. But now they have dispensed with those brethren. And so now there isn't any of that authority in the church. They've all been cut off. Of course, John Woolley claimed that was bogus and he was still a member. And I don't argue with that opinion if that's how he looked at it. But on the records of the church, he wasn't a member. By action of the church itself. And this then becomes the critical issue. Well, it's always the critical issue. It has been the critical issue since the crucifixion of Christ. Priesthood. Priesthood is the issue. It's the fundamental issue in the activities of God's people because, as Joseph Smith said in the 5th article of faith, you have to have authority from God to administer in his ordinances. You have to have it from God. You can't have it from some warm, fuzzy feeling and you think you got inspired and you were born again and now you can go out and preach the gospel. No, God won't recognize that. Priesthood is always the central issue because of that. All the activities, bringing the gospel into people's lives and ministering to them, hinge on that. And so once again, you hear across the pulpit, if you listen to meetings or come to meeting, priesthood and the importance of priesthood. Priesthood. Some people just get fed up with listening to that. It's the central issue, and it's something that you have to understand. If you don't understand priesthood, then you are liable to be led astray. In every split that has happened in the history of this work, people have been led astray simply because they didn't understand priesthood. And so that's something that you need to educate yourself about and learn about and realize. And so from those times in the 20s and on into the 30s until 1934, there's a separation of the priesthood from the church, and the brethren who held that authority. And when Warren Woolley came to the end of his life, he called another group of men to hold that authority and gave it to him before he died. He died in 1934. And that's when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued this famous proclamation that you may or may not have heard about. A couple of years ago, we dramatized it in the 1886 program. Condemning oral marriage as being a sinful thing, and the people who practice it being apostates from the church, and haranguing against the group of people that were doing it, which is our group. We'll call it the group. And so in 1886, John Taylor put those 13 people under covenant that they would perpetuate the practice of plural marriage and see to it that not a year passed that children weren't born under that covenant. And those men who were given the authority had taken that covenant, and they're the primary ones that have it. And the priesthood brethren that preside over you today still have that obligation. You have that obligation to carry forth. That's part of what we have to do. So now, the church also did a wonderful thing. In my mind, this is a wonderful thing. It kind of, I was going to use a off-color word here, and if you'll excuse me, I'll use it. It kind of covered their ass in a way. And this is what they did. In the 1930s, the Brethren began in 1927 to publish information about the fullness of the gospel. Joseph Leslie Broadbent published a publication in which he didn't write his own words. He just brought up information from the Journal of Discourses and other sources about the fact that the principle of plural marriage was a fundamental principle of the gospel, and that the authorities of the church in the 19th century had been very adamant about supporting it. Now the church was just switched around on that doctrine. This became a very serious embarrassment to the church because there were enough people in the church that recognized the truthfulness of those things, and it was disturbing. And so that publication, along with the subsequent publications, and finally the Truth magazine, that was published by Joseph W. Musser, bringing out this information, and not only on plural marriage, but other doctrines of the gospel and similar things, showing where the church had departed from the truth. The church had departed from those things which, some of those things, many of those things, which Joseph Smith established. I say many because as time went on, it wasn't just the Adam God doctrine, plural marriage, but it was other things. And they began to change. There was pressure in the early 1900s on the authorities of the church about the endowment ceremony, because you had the garments of the holy priesthood put on you, and they went down to your wrists and down to your ankles and up to your collarbone. And the styles of women's dress were changing. And the women membership of the church wanted to wear the current styles. If you look at pictures of the 19th century women, pictures of Eliza R. Snow and some of the, Ida Tarbell, maybe some of the suffragettes and those people. If you look at those pictures, you'll see that they're dressed just like Eliza R. Snow's dress. That was the style of the day. And by the early 20th century, that began to change, and the women in the church wanted to wear the current styles. And so they were putting pressure on the authorities of the church to change the garment so that they would be able to wear clothes that didn't expose the garment, because, you take a covenant not to expose it, particularly to public eyes. And Joseph F. Smith was trying to fight this battle when he was president of the church. And after he died, the church began to change the garment. They also changed the form of the ceremonies in the endowment ceremony. And they have changed it quite a bit. And I don't know the specifics because I never went through the temple early in my early life or my later life. So I don't know. There are some people among us who do, but we don't talk about it outside of the sacred environments. And so I don't know. All I know is they've changed it. Uncle Rich was able to testify to that. You'll find his sermons in the sermon books where he talks about it. In 1923. And he'd gone through the temple and went through the temple, and he's observed the changes that were made. And going through subsequent years, he observed the changes. So he can testify from his own experience about the deviation in the endowment ceremony that the church had. And so little by little, they're giving up these things. They thrust the priesthood out of their midst, and they had the public embarrassment of the Truth magazine giving what the doctrine had been. And it's in the Journal of Discourses, but the church suppressed the Journal of Discourses. In fact, they gathered them up and burned some of them, trying to hide the fact that they were doing something that was contrary to the principles of the original church as established by Joseph Smith, the prophet. And so they had to counter this movement. This movement became more coherent under John Y. Barlow when he was the president of priesthood, because there were enough people that came wanting the fullness of the gospel and recognizing where the authority was to administer it, to gather around, that he had a sizable congregation, not as big as we have today, but this was the beginnings of an actual group of people and a congregation that he had to deal with. And people in the church knew about it. And if they chose to join with the priesthood, the church would cut them off. And if they chose to stay in the church but maintain some of their old beliefs, they kind of had to wiggle, maintain their membership. And so here's this contest now as it came out publicly, a contest between the priesthood through the publication of the Truth magazine and the church, who was changing the ordinances and altering the covenants like Isaiah prophesied that would happen. And so the church started I can't call it a campaign, but a movement to counter this work that the priesthood was carrying on and making information public and informing people and exposing their duplicity. And so they issued this statement in 1934. They claim that the 1886 meeting never happened, that the 1886 revelation never was given by John Taylor, and that these people that believed in it and were perpetuating it and the authority that they had was all bogus and didn't exist. So it became this issue. The priesthood no longer in the church left with whatever it was they had, which there were many, many male members that had been given the priesthood legitimately, the Melchizedek priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood. And the church, one of the things they did to try to counter the priesthood movement, the work, we just call it the work, trying to counter the work, was they made a claim, and they did this through their scholars, James E. Talmage and John A. Witzel. John A. Witzel was also a recognized scholar in the church. making the claim that there was no priesthood except in the church, trying to deny the priesthood of the brethren that were carrying on the work. And that was their doctrine. And to consolidate that doctrine into action in the 1930s and for about 40 years, they changed their method of ordaining men to the priesthood. Now, the method, you should be familiar. You take a candidate who is worthy of receiving the priesthood, lay your hands on his head, and confer the priesthood upon him, if he hasn't already had it conferred. And then you give him an office in the church. The offices are in the church, but the priesthood is conferred. So now, hewing to the doctrine that there's no priesthood outside the church and it has to be in the church, they stopped conferring priesthood on their members and just gave them an office in the church. And I thought that was really wonderful because it kind of relieved them of a terrible thing to try and confer priesthood that they're not authorized to confer. So to me, that's the hand of the Lord. But it left the church what? Without any priesthood. Nobody conferred it on anybody for 40 years. And the people who had it conferred upon them all died off over time. Well, in the last 5 years, within the last 5 years, they changed and started conferring priesthood again. And the president of the church said, the priesthood is outside of the church and over the church, which had been advocated by Joseph W. Musk in the Truth magazine for years. Now they're claiming that, but they don't have anything as a basis to claim it. They don't have anything. And so that's the condition of the church today. And if they want to argue against the priesthood work today, the only recourse they have is argumentum ad hominem. It's the only recourse they have because it has been so well substantiated in modern times, from 1980, the 1980s until now, by scholarship within the church and outside of the church, both, that 1886 meeting did in fact happen, and the church can no longer claim it didn't happen. There's too much scholarly research that shows that it happened. Samuel W. Taylor, who was the son of John W. Taylor, who was the son of John Taylor, wrote a biography of his grandfather. And in that biography, he has a little, I can't remember whether it was an epilogue or an appendix or what it was, at the end of the book. At least toward the end of the book. He states, everybody knew that meeting happened. It was common knowledge. Everybody where? Around Kaysville and Centerville, where the meeting occurred. He said there was no secret about that. All the people at the time knew that meeting had occurred. And it has been substantiated by further scholarship. And so the church cannot claim that it didn't happen anymore. They would have egg on their face if they tried to. But they're left outside of the pale of the priesthood, and they're left without priesthood to administer. So I guess they're under the condemnation of the Doctrine and Covenants that roundly condemns people doing such things. So if you have anybody from the church comes around and tries to tell you that this priesthood work is not legitimate, they're going to have to do so by argumentum ad hominem. That means that they will excoriate John W. Woolley, and they will claim that he never had the authority that he was given, and they will denigrate his character, and they will use that as a mechanism to convince you that the church is right and that the priesthood work is wrong. because historically, there's no way for them anymore to claim that that meeting never happened and nothing was done at that time. The turning point in the history of God's people in the earth, the turning point, September 27th, 1886, when provision was made to provide authority to carry on the work in spite of what was happening in the church and let the church go its way. So now the prophecy of Isaiah has been fulfilled. They're changing the ordinances, have changed the ordinances. The fullness of the gospel is no longer practiced by the church. They have made a concerted movement from the time of Heber J. Grant until now to change their face to the world so that they can be friendly with the rest of the world. And when you do that, you start giving up true principles, correct principles, and it just leads from one thing to another because the gospel is interconnected in its whole. As you deny one thing, it's going to lead to another, and you'll have to abandon that, and that'll lead to another. You'll have to abandon that. And they have abandoned most of the fullness of the gospel, not just the authority to administer it. And they don't have a defense because it's easy to demonstrate that those things that were established by Joseph Smith are being carried on by proper authority today. And if you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet and the things he revealed were eternal principles, now we have this saying, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, how can you change the fundamental principles and ordinances of the gospel and still be on God's side? And therefore, the things that are in the Journal of Discourses that the brethren taught, were instructed by Joseph Smith, have to be as sound and true today as they were then. You can't argue that, oh, we have to change this because the ladies don't like the way the old dresses are made. Can't make those kinds of claims. So we are commissioned with preserving and perpetuating the gospel as it was restored by Joseph Smith. That's what this work is about. Now you can believe in that or you cannot believe in it, just like any person in the world can accept Mormonism or deny Mormonism. If you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, the things he established as far as any eternal principles go have to be as true today as they were then. And what did the church do about that? I mean, they were confronted with these things published in the Truth magazine, and they tried to counter them, and they were not successful in countering them. They took the course that is usually taken in an organization where there are fundamental things established and the current administration wants to go against them and change them, but the congregation or the population that they administer still believes them. They said this: we are your leaders. You just listen to us and do what we say. We're your leaders. And they didn't have any other argument than that. That's a pretty weak argument. I mean, it's a pretty weak argument if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If it doesn't involve that principle, it doesn't matter. It's just human activity. It's human activity. So people change. And here is the fundamental problem with religion. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but people change. And how are we going to live our lives so that we don't abide changes in eternal principles and we yield to them in spite of all the world around us? And that's why you hear the brethren say, come out of her, O ye my people, as Isaiah said a long time ago, come out of Babylon. Don't take on the things of the world that will cause you to change your fundamental principles that are the basis of your life in pursuing righteousness. So you need to understand these things. We need to know why the church is where it is today. And we need to know why the work is where it is today. We need to know why they're not together. We need to know why we're here, not over the hill, which is another story that we have the time to go into. Today, you need to know these things. I know that there's a lot of pressure on the rising generation, and with the electronic media we have, there are all kinds of opinions people have. You go on Facebook and people can say anything. They don't have to substantiate it. It's your responsibility to say, hey, wait a minute, that might not be true. And if I'm interested enough, I can investigate it and find out. That's your responsibility. And what you should do if you see claims on the electronic media or published by anybody that you don't fully understand or that are condemnatory to the priesthood of God, don't just accept them because they were put out there. Do your homework. Study the history of this work and the publications that the priesthood has issued and the lives of the people who lived the fullness of the gospel. Pattern your life after those principles. Learn how to understand priesthood. That will keep you on the right track.
So we got to go deep more. Whatever that happens, see you back there. And then if they have questions formulating and what Brother calls making action in the next panel.
We'll take questions for Brother Cawley during the next panel at 3:00. So we're going to excuse you to your workshops for the next 45 minutes, and we'll meet back here for the final keynote and panel discussion at 3:00.